Hi everyone, so sorry it's been a couple of days since I've gotten these uploaded. I did one chapter on over the weekend, and then I went to go add it after work yesterday, and it was more than an hour long. So I'm going to split it into part 1 and part 2. So here's the intro for part 1, and then I'm just going to go right into it with my actual intro that I had at the beginning of the last video. Hi everyone, welcome to part 6 of my series, A Chapter a Day Keeps the Fascists Away, where I read history with you. So we can learn how we got here and how we can move forward in the United States, because things are pretty scary right now. So if you're wanting to learn history and about politics and racism in this country, definitely stay tuned. I already have the first several chapters up. I just point you all out at my garden so you can look at the birds and the butterflies, and I read a chapter. So the first book that we're doing is A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. We're on chapter 5. The other chapters, as well as the introduction in the back of the book, are already up. I'm sorry for not getting any chapters in over the weekend. Life happens. I'm going to do my very best to try to get these up daily. It takes a while to read these to you all, and life, so I'll do my very best. Thank you guys if you're returning. I really appreciate it. I'm hopeful that we can do a book club at the end of this. So let's get into it. Chapter 5, A Kind of Revolution. The American victory over the British Army was made possible by the existence of an already armed people. Just about every white male had a gun and could shoot. The revolutionary leadership distrusted the mobs of poor, but they knew the revolution had no appeal to slaves and Indians. They would have to woo the armed white population. This was not easy. Yes, mechanics and sailors, some others, were incensed against the British, but general enthusiasm for the war was not strong. While much of the white male population went into military service at one time or another during the war, only a small fraction stayed. John Shai, in his study of the Revolutionary Army, a people numerous and armed, says they grew weary of being bullied by local committees of safety, by corrupt deputy assistant commissaries of supply, and by bands of ragged strangers with guns in their hands calling themselves soldiers of the Revolution. Shai estimates that perhaps a fifth of the population was actively treasonous. John Adams had an estimated a third opposed, a third in support, and a third neutral. Alexander Hamilton, an aide of George Washington and an up-and-coming member of the new elite, wrote from his headquarters, "Our countrymen have all the folly of the ass and all the passiveness of the sheep. They are determined not to be free. If we are saved, France and Spain must save us." Slavery got in the way in the South. South Carolina, insecure since the slave uprising in Stono in 1739, could hardly fight against the British. Her militia had to be used to keep slaves under control. The men who first joined the colonial militia were generally hallmarks of respectability, or at least of full citizenship in their communities, Shai says. Excluded from the militia were friendly Indians, free Negroes, white servants, and free white men who had no stable home. But desperation led to the recruiting of the less respectable whites. Massachusetts and Virginia provided for drafting strollers, vagrants, into the militia. In fact, the military became a place of promise for the poor, who might rise in rank, acquire some money, and change their social status. Here was the traditional device by which those in charge of any social order mobilize and discipline a recalcitrant population, offering the adventure and rewards of military service to get poor people to fight for a cause that they may not see clearly as their own. A wounded American lieutenant at Bunker Hill, interviewed by Peter Oliver, a Tory, who admittedly might have been looking for such a response, told how he had joined the rebel forces. "I was a shoemaker and got my living by my labor. When this rebellion came on, I saw some of my neighbors got into commission who were no better than myself. I was very ambitious and did not like to see those men above me. I was asked to enlist as a private soldier. I offered to enlist upon having a lieutenant's commission, which was granted. I imagined myself now in a way of promotion. If I was killed in battle, there would be an end of me. But if my captain was killed, I would rise in rank and should still have a chance to rise higher. These, sir, were the only motives of my entering into the service. For as to the dispute between Great Britain and the colonies, I know nothing of it." John Shai investigated the subsequent experience of that Bunker Hill lieutenant. He was William Scott of Peterborough, New Hampshire, and after a year as a prisoner of the British, he escaped, made his way back to the American Army, fought in battles in New York, was captured again by the British, and escaped again by swimming the Hudson River one night with his sword tied around his neck and his watch pinned to his hat. He returned to New Hampshire, recruited a company of his own, including his 2 eldest sons, and fought in various battles until his health gave way. He watched his eldest son die of camp fever after 6 years of service. He had sold his farm in Peterborough for a note that, with inflation, became worthless. After the war, he came to public attention when he rescued 8 people from drowning after their boat turned over in New York Harbor. He then got a job surveying western lands with the army, but caught a fever and died in 1796. Scott was one of many revolutionary fighters, usually of lower military ranks from poor and obscure backgrounds. Shaw's study of the Peterborough contingent shows that the prominent and substantial citizens of the town had served only briefly in the war. Other American towns show the same pattern. As Shaw puts it, revolutionary America may have been a middle-class society, happier and more prosperous than any other in its time, but it contained a large and growing number of fairly poor people, and many of them did much of the actual fighting and suffering between 1775 and 1783. A very old story. The military conflict itself, by dominating everything in its time, diminished other issues, made people choose sides in the one contest that was publicly important, forced people into the side of the revolution whose interest in independence was not at all obvious. Ruling elites seem to have learned through the generations, consciously or not, that war makes them more secure against internal trouble. The force of military preparation had a way of pushing neutral people into line. In Connecticut, for instance, a law was passed requiring military service of all males between 16 and 60, omitting certain government officials, ministers, Yale students and faculty, Negroes, Indians, and mulattoes. Someone called to duty would provide a substitute or get out of it by paying £5. When 18 men failed to show up for military duty, they were jailed, and in order to be released, had to pledge to fight in the war. Shaw says the mechanism of their political conversion was the militia. What looks like democratization of the military forces in modern times shows up as something different, a way of forcing large numbers of reluctant people to associate themselves with the national cause, and by the end of the process, believing in it. Sounds familiar to something in my lifetime, anyway. Here in the War for Liberty was conscription, as usual, cognizant of wealth. With the impressment riots against the British still remembered, impressment of seamen by the American Navy was taking place by 1779. A Pennsylvania official said, "We cannot keep observing how similar this conduct is to that of the British officers during our subjection to Great Britain, and are persuaded it will have the same unhappy effects, viz. An estrangement of the affections of the people from authority, which by an easy progression will proceed to open opposition and bloodshed." Watching the new tight discipline of Washington's army, a chaplain in Concord, Massachusetts, wrote, "New lords, new laws. The strictest government is taking place, and great distinction is made between officers and men. Everyone is made to know his place and keep it, or be immediately tied up and receive not 1, but 30 to 40 lashes." The Americans lost the first battles in the war: Bunker Hill, Brooklyn Heights, Harlem Heights, and the Deep South. They won small battles at Trenton and Princeton, and then in a turning point, a big battle at Saratoga, New York in 1777. Washington's frozen army hung on at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, while Benjamin Franklin negotiated an alliance with the French monarchy, which was anxious for revenge on England. The war turned to the south, where the British won victory after victory until the Americans, aided by a large French army with the French Navy blocking off the British from supplies and reinforcements, won the final victory at the War of Yorktown in Virginia in 1781. Through all of this, the suppressed conflicts between rich and poor among the Americans kept reappearing. In the midst of the war in Philadelphia, which Eric Foner describes as a time of immense profits for some colonists and terrible hardships for others, the inflation, prices rose in 1 month that year by 45%, led to agitation and calls for action. One Philadelphia newspaper carried a reminder that in Europe the people have always done themselves justice when the scarcity of bread has arisen from avarice of forced dollars. They have broken open magazines, appropriated stores to their own use without paying for them, and in some instances have hung up the culprits who created their distress. In May of 1779, the First Company of Philadelphia Artillery petitioned the Assembly about the troubles of the middling and poor, and threatened violence against those who are avariciously intent upon amassing wealth by the destruction of the more virtuous part of the community. That same month, there was a mass meeting, an extra-legal gathering, which called for price reductions and initiated an investigation of Robert Morris, a rich Philadelphian who was accused of holding food from the market. In October came the Fort Wilson riot, in which a militia group marched into the city and to the house of James Wilson, a wealthy lawyer and revolutionary official who had opposed price controls in the Democratic Constitution adopted in Pennsylvania in 1776. The militia were driven away by a silk stocking brigade of well-off Philadelphia citizens. It seems that the majority of white colonists who had a bit of land or no property at all were still better off than slaves or indentured servants or Indians, and could be wooed into the coalition of the Revolution. But when the sacrifices of war became more bitter, the privileges and safety of the rich became harder to accept. About 10% of the white population, an estimate of Jackson, Maine, in the social structure of revolutionary America, large landholders and merchants held 1,000 pounds or more in personal property and 1,000 pounds in land at the least, and these men owned nearly half the wealth of the country and held as slaves 1/7 of the country's people. The Continental Congress, which governed the colonies through the war, was dominated by rich men linked together in factions and compacts by business and family connections. These links connected North and South, East and West. For instance, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia was connected with the Adamses of Massachusetts and the Shippens of Pennsylvania. Delegates from middle and southern colonies were connected with Robert Morris of Pennsylvania through commerce and land speculation. Morris was superintendent of finance, and his assistant was Governor Morris. Morris's plan was to give more assurance to those who had loaned money to the Continental Congress and gain the support of officers by voting half pay for life for those who stuck to the end. This ignored the common soldier who was not getting paid, who was suffering in the cold, dying of sickness, watching the civilian profiteers get rich. On New Year's Day, 1781, the Pennsylvania troops near Morristown, New Jersey, perhaps emboldened by rum, dispersed their officers, killed one captain, wounded others, and were marching, fully armed with cannon, toward the Continental Congress at Philadelphia. George Washington handled it cautiously. Informed of these developments by General Anthony Wayne, he told Wayne not to use force. He was worried that the rebellion might spread to his own troops. He suggested Wayne get a list of the soldiers' grievances and said Congress should not flee in Philadelphia, because then the way would be open for the soldiers to be joined by Philadelphia citizens. He sent Knox rushing to New England on his horse to get 3 months' pay for the soldiers, while he prepared 1,000 men to march on the mutineers as a last resort. A peace was negotiated, in which one half of the men were discharged, the other half got furloughs. Shortly after this, a smaller mutiny took place in New Jersey line, involving 200 men who defied their officers and started out for the state capital at Trenton. Now Washington was ready. 600 men, who themselves had been well fed and clothed, marched on the mutineers and surrounded and disarmed them. 3 ringleaders were put on trial immediately in the field. 1 was pardoned, and 2 were shot by firing squads made up of their friends, who wept as they pulled the triggers. It was an example, Washington said. 2 years later, there was another mutiny in the Pennsylvania line. The war was over and the army had disbanded, but 80 soldiers, demanding their pay, invaded the Continental Congress headquarters in Philadelphia and forced the members to flee across the river to Princeton, anonymously turned out of doors, as one historian sorrowfully wrote, John Fiske, The Critical Period, by a handful of drunken mutineers. The soldiers in the Revolution could do only rarely rebel against their authorities. Civilians could do much more easily. Ronald Hoffman says the Revolution plunged the states of Delaware, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and to a much lesser degree Virginia, into divisive civil conflicts that persisted during the entire period of struggle. The Southern lower classes resisted being mobilized for the Revolution. They saw themselves under the rule of a political elite, win or lose against the British. In Maryland, for instance, by the new Constitution of 1776, to run for governor, one had to own 5,000 pounds of property. To run for state senator, 1,000 pounds. Thus, 90% of the population were excluded from holding office. And so, as Hoffman says, small slaveholders, non-slaveholding planters, tenants, renters, and casual day laborers posed a serious problem of social control for the Whig elite. With black slaves 25% of the population, and in some counties 50%, fear of slave revolts grew. George Washington had turned down the requests of blacks seeking freedom to fight in the Revolutionary Army. So when the British military commander in Virginia, Lord Dunmore, promised freedom to Virginia slaves who joined the forces, this created consternation. A report from one Maryland county worried about poor whites encouraging slave runaways. The insolence of the Negroes in this county has come to such a height that we are under a necessity of disarming them, which we effected on Saturday last. We took about 80 guns, some bayonets, swords, etc. The malicious and imprudent speeches of some among the lower classes of whites have introduced them to believe that their freedom depended on the success of the king's troops. We cannot therefore be too vigilant nor too rigorous with those who promote and encourage this disposition in our slaves. Even more unsettling was white rioting in Maryland against leading families supporting the revolution who were suspected of hoarding needed commodities. The class hatred of some of these disloyal people was expressed by one man who said it was better for the people to lay down their arms and pay the duties and taxes laid upon them by the king and parliament than to be brought into slavery and to be commanded and ordered about as they were. A wealthy Maryland landowner, Charles Carroll, took note of the surly mood all around him. There is a mean, low, dirty envy which creeps through all ranks and cannot suffer a man a superiority of fortune, of merit, or of understanding in fellow citizens. Either of these are sure to entail a general ill will and dislike upon the owners. Despite this, Maryland authorities retained control. They made concessions, taxing land and slaves more heavily, letting debtors pay in paper money. It was a sacrifice by the upper class to maintain power, and it worked. In the lower South, however, in the Carolinas and Georgia, according to Hoffman, vast regions were left without the slightest apparition of authority. The general mood was to take no part in a war that seemed to have nothing for them. Authoritative personages on both sides demanded that common people supply material, reduce consumption, leave their families, and even risk their lives. Forced to make hard decisions, many flailed out in frustration or evaded and defied first one side and then the other. Washington's military commander in the lower South, Nathanael Greene, dealt with disloyalty by a policy of concessions to some, brutality to others. In a letter to Thomas Jefferson, he described a raid by his troops on Loyalists. They made a dreadful carnage of them. Upwards of 100 were killed, and most of the rest cut to pieces. It has had a very happy effect on those disaffected persons, of which there were too many in this country. Greene told one of his generals to strike terror into our enemies and give spirit to our friends. On the other hand, he advised the governor of Georgia to open a door for the disaffected of your state to come in. In general, throughout the states, concessions were kept to a minimum. The new constitutions that were drawn up in all states from 1776 to 1780 were not much different from the old ones. Although property qualifications for voting and holding office were lowered in some instances, in Massachusetts they were increased. Only Pennsylvania abolished them totally. The new Bill of Rights had modifying provisions. North Carolina, providing for religious freedom, added that nothing herein contained shall be construed to exempt preachers of treasonable or seditious discourses from legal trial and punishment. Maryland, New York, Georgia, and Massachusetts took similar cautions. The American Revolution is sometimes said to have brought about the separation of church and state. The northern states had made such declarations, but after 1776 they adopted taxes that enforced everyone to support Christian teachings. William G. McLaughlin, quoting Supreme Court Justice David Brewer in 1892 that this is a Christian nation, says of the separation of church and state in the Revolution that it was neither conceived of nor carried out. Far from being left to itself, religion was embedded into every aspect and institution of American life. One would look, in examining the Revolution's effect on class relations, at what happened to land confiscated from fleeing Loyalists. It was distributed in such a way as to give double opportunity to the revolutionary leaders to enrich themselves and their friends, and to parcel out some land to small farmers to create a broad base of support for the new government. Indeed, this became characteristic of the new nation. Finding itself possessed of enormous wealth, it could create the richest ruling class in history and still have enough for the middle classes to act as a buffer between the rich and the dispossessed. The huge land holdings of the Loyalists had been one of the great incentives to revolution. Lord Fairfax in Virginia had more than 5 million acres encompassing 21 counties. Lord Baltimore's income from his Maryland holdings exceeded 30,000 pounds a year. After the Revolution, Lord Fairfax was protected. He was a friend of George Washington. But other loyalist holders of great estates, especially those who were absentees, had their land confiscated. In New York, the number of freeholding small farmers increased after the Revolution, and there were fewer tenant farmers who had created so much trouble in the pre-revolutionary years. Although the numbers of independent farmers grew, according to Roland Berthoff and John Murren, the class structure did not change radically. The ruling group went through personnel changes as the rising merchants' families of Boston, New York, or Philadelphia slipped quite credibly into the social status, and sometimes the very houses of those who failed in business or suffered confiscation and exile for loyalty to the crown. Edmund Morgan sums up the class nature of the Revolution this way. The fact that the lower ranks were involved in the contest should not obscure the fact that the contest itself was generally a struggle for office and power between members of the upper class, the new against the established. Looking at the situation after the Revolution, Richard Morris comments, "Everywhere one finds inequality. He finds the people of we the people of the United States," a phrase coined by a very rich Governor Morris, did not mean Indians or blacks or women or white servants. In fact, there were more indentured servants than ever, and the Revolution did nothing to end and little to ameliorate white bondage. Carl Degler says, out of our past, no new social class came to power through the door of the American Revolution. The men who engineered the revolt were largely members of the colonial ruling class. And I want everybody to listen to me very carefully when I say this next sentence that I'm about to read. George Washington was the richest man in America. John Hancock was a prosperous Boston merchant. Benjamin Franklin was a wealthy printer, and so on. This is so important to remember, that rich white men who owned slaves and didn't think that black people or native people that they were killing or women were equals, or white indentured servants were equals, or white slaves were equals. These rich white men made the rules of this country that we're still following 250 years later. And they entrenched it with Christianity. Entrenched it. I'm just saying. The math is mathing, folks. Anyway. On the other hand, town mechanics, laborers, and seamen, as well as small farmers, were swept into the people by the rhetoric of the Revolution, by the camaraderie of military service, by the distribution of some land. Thus was created a substantial body of support, a national consensus, something that, even with the exclusion of ignored and oppressed people, could be called America. Stoughton Lynn's close study of Dutchess County, New York, in the Revolutionary period corroborates this. There were tenant risings in 1766 against the huge feudal estates in New York. The Rensselaerswyck holding was 1 million acres. Tenants, claiming some of the land for themselves, unable to get satisfaction in the courts, turned to violence. In Poughkeepsie, 1,700 armed tenants had closed the courts and broken open the jails, but the uprising was crushed. During the Revolution, there was a struggle in Dutchess County over the disposition of confiscated Loyalist hands, but it was mainly between different elite groups. One of these, the Poughkeepsie Anti-Federalists, opponents of the Constitution, included men on the make, newcomers in land and business. They made promises to the tenants to gain their support, exploiting their grievances to build their own political careers and maintain their own fortunes. During the Revolution, to mobilize soldiers, the tenants were promised land. A prominent landowner of Dutchess County wrote in 1777 that a promise to make tenants freeholders would instantly bring you at least 6,000 able farmers into the field. But the farmers who enlisted in the Revolution and expected to get something out of it found that, as privates in the army, they received $6.66 a month, while a colonel received $75 a month. They watched local government contractors like Melancton Smith and Matthew Patterson become rich, while the pay they received in continental currency became worthless with inflation. All this led tenants to become a threatening force in the midst of a war. Many stopped paying rent. The legislature, worried, passed a bill to confiscate Loyalist land and add 400 new freeholders to the 1,800 already in the county. This meant a strong new voting bloc for the faction of the rich that would become anti-federalist in 1788. Once the new landholders were brought into the privileged circle of the Revolution and seemed politically under control, their leaders, Melancton Smith and others, at first opposed to adoption of the Constitution, switched to support, and with New York ratifying, adoption was ensured. The new freeholders found that they had stopped being tenants, but were now mortgages, paying back loans from banks instead of rent to landlords. It seems that the rebellion against British rule allowed a certain group of the colonial elite to replace those loyal to England, give some benefits to small landholders, and leave poor white working people and tenant farmers in very much their old situation. What did the Revolution mean to the Native Americans, the Indians? They had been ignored by the fine words of the Declaration, had not been considered equal, certainly not in choosing those who would govern the American territories in which they lived, nor in being able to pursue happiness as they pursued it for centuries before the white Europeans arrived. Now, with the British out of the way, the Americans could begin the inexorable process of pushing the Indians off their lands, killing them if they resisted. In short, as Francis Jennings puts it, the white Americans were fighting against British imperial control in the East and for their own imperialism in the West. Before the Revolution, the Indians had been subdued by force in Virginia and in New England. Elsewhere, they had worked out modes of coexistence with the colonies. But around 1750, with the colonial population growing fast, the pressure to move westward onto new land set the stage for conflict with the Indians. Land agents from the east began appearing in the Ohio River Valley on the territory of a confederation of tribes called the Covenant Chain, for which the Iroquois were spokesmen. In New York, through intricate swindling, 800,000 acres of Mohawk land were taken, ending the period of Mohawk-New York friendship. Chief Hendrick of the Mohawks is recorded speaking his bitterness to Governor George Clinton and the Provincial Council of New York in 1753. Brother, when we came here to relate our grievances about our lands, we expected to have something done for us, and we have told you that the covenant chain of our forefathers was likely to be broken. And brother, you tell us that we shall be addressed at Albany, but we know them so well we will not trust them, for they, the Albany merchants, are but no people but devils. So, as soon as we come home, we will send up a belt of wampum to our brothers, the other 5 nations, to acquaint them with the covenant chain is broken between you and us. So, brother, you are not to expect to hear of me any more, and brother, we desire to hear of you no more. When the British fought the French for North America in the 7 Years' War, the Indians fought on the side of the French. The French were traders but not occupiers of Indian lands, while the British clearly coveted their hunting grounds and living space. Someone reported the conversation of Shingas, chief of the Delaware Indians, with the British General Braddock, who sought his help against the French. Shingas asked General Braddock whether the Indians that were friends to the English might not be permitted to live and trade among the English and have hunting grounds sufficient to support themselves and families, on which General Braddock said that no savage should inherit the land, on which Shingas and the other chiefs answered that if they might not have liberty to live on the land, then they should not fight for it. For real. When the war ended in 1763, the French, ignoring their old allies, ceded to the British lands of the west of the Appalachians. The Indians, therefore, united to make war on the British western forts. This is called Pontiac's Conspiracy by the British, but a liberation war for independence in the words used by Francis Jennings. Under orders from British General Geoffrey Amherst, the commander of Fort Pitts gave the attacking Indian chiefs, with whom he was negotiating, blankets from the smallpox hospital. It was a pioneering effort at what is now called biological warfare. An epidemic soon spread among the Indians. Jesus. Despite this and the burning of villages, the British could not destroy the will of the Indians, who continued guerrilla war. A peace was made, with the British agreeing to establish a line at the Appalachians, beyond which settlement would not encroach on Indian territory. This was the Royal Proclamation of 1763, and it angered Americans. The original Virginia Charter said its land went westward to the ocean. It helps to explain why most of the Indians fought for England during the Revolution. With their French allies, then with their English allies gone, the Indians faced a new land-coveting nation alone. The Americans assumed now that the Indian land was theirs. But the expeditions they sent westward to establish this were overcome, which they recognized in the names they gave these battles: Harmar's Humiliation and St. Clair's Shame. And even when General Anthony Wayne defeated the Indians' Western Confederation in 1798 at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, he had to recognize their powers. In the Treaty of Grenville, it was agreed that in return for certain cessions of the land, the United States would give up claims to the Indian lands north of the Ohio, east of the Mississippi, and south of the Great Lakes, but that if the Indians decided to sell these lands, they would offer them first to the United States. Jennings, putting the Indian into the center of the American Revolution, after all, it was the Indian land that everyone was fighting over, sees the Revolution as a multiplicity of variously oppressed and exploited peoples who preyed upon each other. With the Eastern elite controlling the lands on the seaboard, the poor, seeking land, were forced to go west, there becoming a useful bulwark for the rich because, as Jennings says, the first target of the Indian's hatchet was the frontiersman's skull. The situation of black slaves as a result of the American Revolution was more complex. Thousands of blacks fought with the British. 5,000 were with the revolutionaries, most of them from the North, but there were also free blacks from Virginia and Maryland. The lower South was reluctant to arm blacks. Amid the urgency and chaos of war, thousands took their freedom, leaving on British ships at the end of the war to settle in England, Nova Scotia, the West Indies, or Africa. Many others stayed in America as free blacks, evading their masters. In the northern states, the combination of blacks in the military, the lack of powerful economic need for slaves, and the rhetoric of revolution led to the end of slavery, but very slowly. As late as 1810, 30,000 blacks, 1/4 of the black population of the North, remained slaves. In 1840, there were still 1,000 slaves in the North. In the Upper South, there were more free Negroes than before, leading to more control legislation. In the Lower South, slavery expanded with the growth of rice and cotton plantations. What the revolution did was to create space and opportunity for blacks to begin making demands of white society. Sometimes these demands came from the new small black elites in Baltimore, Philadelphia, Richmond, Savannah, sometimes from articulate and bold slaves. Pointing to the Declaration of Independence, blacks petitioned Congress and the state legislatures to abolish slavery to give blacks equal rights. In Boston, blacks asked for city money, which whites were getting, to educate their children. In Norfolk, they asked to be allowed to testify in court. Nashville, blacks asserted that free Negroes ought to have the same opportunities of doing well that any person would have. Peter Matthews, a free Negro butcher in Charleston, joined other free black artisans and tradesmen in petitioning the legislature to repeal discriminatory laws against blacks. In 1780, 7 blacks in Dartmouth, Massachusetts, petitioned to the legislature for the right to vote, linking taxation to representation. We apprehend ourselves to be aggrieved in that while we were not allowed the privilege of freemen in the state, having no vote or influence in the election of those that tax us, yet many of our color, as is well known, have cheerfully entered the field of battle in the defense of the common cause, and that as we conceive against a similar exertion of power in regard to taxation, too well known to need a recital in this place. A black man, Benjamin Banneker, who taught himself mathematics and astronomy, predicted accurately a solar eclipse and was appointed to plan the new city of Washington, wrote to Thomas Jefferson. I suppose it is a truth too well attested to you to need a proof here that we are a race of beings who have long labored under the abuse and censure of the world, that we have long been looked upon with an eye of contempt, and that we have long been considered rather as brutish than human, and scarcely capable of mental endowments. I apprehend you will embrace every opportunity to eradicate that train of absurd and false ideas and opinions which so generally prevails with respect to us, and that your sentiments are concurrent with mine, which are, that one universal Father hath given being to us all, and that he hath not only made us all of one flesh, but that he hath also, without partiality, afforded us all the same sensation and endowed us with all the same facilities. All right, that was